Hello, Facebook viewers. My name is Eric Nuss. I'm the director of Forward by Henry Schein. I'm joined today by Justin Ditkofsky from Cirrus Consulting Group. There are a lot of questions and misunderstandings about real estate, leasing versus buying, and we're going to try to understand some of the different things that are happening in the marketplace. So, Justin, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Henry ScheinChats.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's great being here together at the Chicago Midwinter, and we're eager to learn more about leasing. So tell us, what's going on in the marketplace right now relative to leasing and buying of dental practices specifically?
So, you know what, there hasn't been major change in the last, call it 5 or 10 years, with the exception of it's awfully expensive to open a dental practice, as most people know. And if you don't have a well-structured lease agreement, if you don't have the real estate part of the business properly protected, you're leaving yourself in a vulnerable position, right? So, we have conversations daily with doctors who want to learn about the pros and cons of buying real estate versus leasing real estate, and it's very much situational, right? It depends on so many factors: where you are geographically, is it affordable, is it a good investment? Generally, my one piece of advice is look at the real estate investment completely independent from the practice.
Okay. When you look at different communities, be it rural or urban, is there a different strategy that you would recommend relative to owning or leasing the space? For
sure. You know what? In more metro urban markets, generally buying real estate is going to be a lot more expensive and capital intensive, and in most cases it may not be affordable to buy commercial real estate. In the more rural parts of the country, certainly more affordable. But again, you have to look at it more on a case-by-case basis in terms of what are the goals and objectives of the investor or doctor, what are they looking to accomplish long-term, where are they career-wise, right? Because it would be challenging for a doctor in the last few years of their career to justify making a huge investment into buying real estate and then building a new office and then sell the practice within 2 or 3 or 4 years. They won't see a return, right?
Sure.
So highly situational. We usually tell people, look at the real estate as a completely separate investment, analyze the pros and cons, determine the affordability, and you make a sound investment, right?
So something you just mentioned makes me think of a couple questions I want to ask you. So as a practitioner goes through the various stages of their professional career,
right?
They start out, they start out as an associate, they want to buy out the senior doctor at some point. There's a transition that's somewhat natural.
Right.
Ready to go.
Right.
Doctor to take over the business. Somebody else owns the property. Maybe it's the doctor that's selling the business.
Right.
Maybe it's a landlord who owns the entire strip or the center, the building. And as that transition is forming, what things does that buying doctor specifically need to consider as they're acquiring the practice relative to the real estate?
So,
and assuming that it's a lease-based.
Right. So in either case, regardless of who owns the building, they're going to have a real estate component of that whole transaction.
Of course.
Right? And there are a few different moving parts. So first of all, buying practices, fairly sizable investment. And generally the lenders involved in the transaction want to see some type of long-term security and predictability in the space.
Okay.
Right? They want to make sure that if they're financing a $500,000 or $1 million plus practice acquisition, that there is 5 or 10 plus years of predictability in that space, so they don't have to worry about the purchasing doctor requiring more capital to pick up and move or relocate the office. The second part of it is the lease agreement. In most cases, the entire sale or acquisition of the practice hinges on the transferability or the assignment of the lease from the seller to the buyer. And most people think it's straightforward, but it's not. It's not always a very straightforward process.
So talk through that a little bit more. The reassignment of the lease. Like, what do you see where there's some pitfalls in that space that you've seen where doctors are getting ready to buy a practice, be it new or their former associates, and they're trying to take over that lease, and what could potentially get in the way of that practice decision?
So, we work on hundreds of lease negotiations and represent hundreds of doctors a year in the negotiations of their lease, many of which are going through the motions of transitioning either on the buying or selling side.
Right.
And what we see often happens with the assignment of the lease is, first of all, you need to get the building owner's consent to transfer or assign a lease from the seller to the buyer. In a lot of cases, it might be straightforward. The building owner may have no issues with the new incoming doctor.
Okay.
However, what we're seeing is more of a trend these days is a lot of building owners are actually leveraging control over the assignment or transfer of the lease agreement to impose unreasonable conditions on the selling doctor. So to give you a perfect example, we're working on a case right now in New York. It's a general practice. They've been open for 20 plus years. Institutional landlord, and they have approached the landlord to request approval to transfer the lease to the doctor purchasing the practice.
Okay.
The landlord has advised the selling doctor they will only consent to an assignment of the lease predicated on either a 25% increase in rent or they're asking for 1% of proceeds from the sale of the practice. And this is a doctor who thought it would be a straightforward process.
Right.
It's now complicating the sale. We're now involved trying to smooth things out. However, it's a lot easier to prevent the problem as opposed to remedy the problem when we're now, faced with this type of situation.
Far down the road.
Right.
Okay, so that's really great information. So then what about the doctor who's mid-career and actually owns the property?
Right.
And is there any recommendations or strategies that they might be able to mitigate some of their exposure? Or
For sure. We tell everyone when we're working with doctors who own their buildings, there's a few different moving parts in terms of mitigating risk and being set up properly.
Sure.
First of all, and this is a conversation I usually recommend having with their CPA or financial advisor as a starting point,
Of course.
but it's usually beneficial to rent the space from yourself. So let's just say you owned a building and you're an owner-occupant where you're practicing out of a building you own. It's usually beneficial to have the building incorporated under one type of entity, the practice separately incorporated under a different entity, and rent the space from yourself for tax and liability purposes. In order to do that, though, you actually need a physical lease document in place, which most people don't have. Most building owners, owner-occupants, they pay themselves rent for tax purposes, but they don't actually have physical documents in place, which leaves them in a relatively exposed or vulnerable position. The second part of it is dentistry is becoming more expensive over time. The cost of getting into dentistry in terms of graduating from dental school is becoming exorbitant. We're talking hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of dollars. In a matter of time, you might even get close to $1 million in terms of debt to actually graduate from a dental program.
Sure.
And most incoming doctors who are purchasing the practice are usually not in a position to buy the real estate in the same transaction. So what happens is the doctor who owns the real estate, who probably wants to sell the practice as well as the real estate, in most cases that can't happen. So, or at least not immediately.
Right.
So what we're telling people who are, whether they're mid-career or late-stage career or early stages of their career and they own the real estate, talk to your advisor about having the real estate and practice separately incorporated, get a proper lease in place for tax and liability purposes. If you sell the building and you sell the practice in one transaction, wonderful. If you don't, you have the proper documentation so you're set up to do what you need to do, right?
Sure. Justin, one more question before we wrap up here. If there were like 2 or 3 things that you could give as a recommendation of must-dos
Right.
for the folks that are watching us, what would those top 2 or 3 things be relative to their lease, of course?
So the first of all, and probably the most basic and simple advice would be, if you lease your space, read your lease. Pick up a copy of it. It may not be a pleasant read, but read your lease agreement.
Sure.
Secondly, get a very good understanding of when does your lease agreement expire. In your lease today, do you have a renewal option? And if so, how much notice do you need to give the landlord if you intend to renew?
Okay.
Because what happens is a lot of people don't know when their lease expires. And they miss some of the critical dates. And we're telling doctors who lease their space, who are already in a lease, you can renegotiate the lease as long as you start that process a year to 2 years before the lease expires.
And why that far out in advance?
Because most landlords know that it takes months, if not over a year, for a dentist to pick up and move. If you start a negotiation with a somewhat sophisticated landlord with a month or a few months left on your lease, they're not going to be inclined to give you favorable terms because they know it's almost impossible for you to move.
Right.
And even if you may not move, it's part of your leverage, right? That you may at some point move if the terms in the lease don't make sense. So I guess the best advice I can give people is take a look at your lease, find out when does the lease expire. If you're in that window where you're in the 1 or 2 year window, review it, get a professional. You can get Cirrus Consulting Group, we'd be happy to review it. understand what's in your lease, understand when does it expire. It's probably one of the more critical documents for the practice, because if you don't have a facility, you don't have a business.
That's the problem.
Right?
Any other major pitfalls that you would say to stay away from, or things that you would recommend not doing?
There's a lot. In the interest of time, there's a lot that I would say not to do.
Yeah.
The best thing I could say is, the best advice I can give to any doctor across the country is, get your lease reviewed by a professional. Get it reviewed by a real estate attorney. Our firm has a number of real estate attorneys who are highly experienced, but get it reviewed by someone who not just knows real estate, but understands dentistry. Because a lease agreement for a dental practice needs to be structured fundamentally very different than a lease agreement for other type of professional services or retail businesses. So understand what's in your lease, get it reviewed by a professional, make sure it's structured properly to give you the long-term predictability and stability you need. And make sure you have the peace of mind that you know that you can practice happy dentistry for the foreseeable future without any very costly real estate problems.
Okay. Justin, it's been a pleasure spending some time with you this
pleasure.
morning. And the partnership that Cirrus has continued to have with Henry Schein is a great relationship, and we sure do appreciate being able to support our customers together.